Close your eyes for a moment. Not all the way, not yet. Just let your gaze soften. Let the edges of the room blur and disappear. And let yourself drift toward a place that feels like the memory of cold air on your cheeks and the smell of pine resin and something ancient underneath the snow. There is a place in the world of ice and fire that exists apart from all other places. It sits above the neck of a great continent, beyond a swamp-choked bottleneck of land that acts like a natural gate, separating whatever lies to the south from whatever exists to the north. And what exists to the north is something you can feel more than describe. It is a heaviness in the air, a patience, or a kind of quiet that has been cultivated over such a long stretch of time that it has stopped being the absence of noise and started being something in its own right, a presence, substantial and old, like the pressure of 1,000 winters, all pressing down at once. The north of Westeros is the largest of the 7 kingdoms. It stretches from the neck in the south all the way up to a wall of solid ice in the far north, and in between those 2 points you have hundreds and hundreds of miles of dense forest, frozen rivers, granite hillsides streaked white with snow, and plains of open ground that the wind sweeps across with a kind of bored ferocity, as if it doesn't even have to try. In summer, the land can be beautiful in that stripped-down, unadorned way. Wildflowers in the clearings, salmon running up the rivers, wolves moving through birch stands at dusk. But the north does not apologize for its harshness. It doesn't soften itself for visitors. It has been this way for 8,000 years, and it will be this way long after the last lord has been laid in the crypts. And at the heart of all that, at the very center of the north, sitting on a stretch of land threaded through with natural hot springs that keep it warmer than anything has a right to be in such a cold place, stands a castle, a massive, sprawling, irregular castle that looks less like it was planned and more like it was accumulated, like it grew the way a tree grows, adding new rings over time, newer sections pressing up against older ones, until the whole thing covers acres and acres of ground, and no single person could claim to know every room. This is Winterfell. And the family that built it, the family that has held it for 8,000 years through invasion and war, and the kind of losses that would have broken any other house in the world, is House Stark. To speak about House Stark is to speak about something that doesn't translate cleanly into the language of most noble houses. When you talk about the Lannisters, you talk about wealth, about gold and ambition and the dangerous brilliance of people who have had too much power for too long. When you talk about the Targaryens, you talk about dragons and destiny and a kind of divine fire that sets them apart from ordinary men. But the Starks are something different. They are the land itself, or as close to the land as a family of people can get. Their qualities are northern qualities. Yet their virtues are the virtues of people who have spent 8 millennia watching winter come and learning to outlast it. Endurance, stubbornness. A loyalty so deep, it might as well be geological. A code of honor that can be, and has been, their greatest strength and their most catastrophic weakness, often at the same time. Their words are not a boast. They do not say they are mighty, or that they will prevail, or that their enemies will fall before them. Their words are a warning. They are a reminder. They are 3 syllables that carry within them the weight of everything the Starks have ever been through, and everything they have ever learned from it. Winter is coming, not might come, not may eventually arrive. Is coming. It is always coming. There is always another hard time approaching, another season of cold and death and scarcity. Oh, and the only way to survive it is to keep your eyes open and your stores full and your people close. That phrase tells you everything about House Stark and the North and the relationship between a people and the land they come from. In a world where other noble houses choose their words to brag, hear me roar, ours is the fury, growing strong. The Starks chose a different kind of declaration. They chose to remind themselves and everyone around them that comfort is temporary, that warmth is something you have to fight for, and that only the prepared survive. The gray direwolf on their banner speaks to the same truth. Not a lion or a dragon or some idealized creature from myth, but a wolf, an animal that is real, that hunts in the northern forests, that operates in a pack, and that survives through collective effort and individual ferocity in equal measure. The dire wolf is larger than the wolves you know, ancient and powerful in a way that ordinary wolves are not. But it is still a wolf, still a creature of this world, of cold ground and sharp hunger, and the necessity of the hunt. The Starks chose to be represented by something real. Their sigil is gray on white, and there is something in that color choice too, the gray of stone and iron and morning sky, against the white of snow and ice and bone-cold wind. No gold, no red, no bright warm southern colors, just the palette of the north, honest and spare and enduring. The history of House Stark is the history of the North itself, and that history stretches back far enough that the earliest parts of it have faded from record into myth. What we can trace, through fragments in old texts, through the names carved on tombs in the crypts beneath Winterfell, through the legends that old Nan used to tell in a low voice by firelight, is a story that begins at the very dawn of human civilization in Westeros, and winds its way across 8,000 years to a family of children scattered across a continent, each one carrying the name Stark into places it had never been meant to go. It is a story worth knowing. It is a story worth carrying with you. And tonight, we are going to walk through it together, from the very beginning, all the way to the end, one step at a time, through the dark and the cold, with the fire low and the wolves somewhere out in the trees. So, settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the world outside this moment go quiet, and let the history of House Stark begin. If you are watching this right now and finding the history of Westeros exactly as comforting as I do, I would genuinely love to know where you are in the world. Drop a comment below. Tell me the time and the place you are watching from. There is something lovely about the idea of people from completely different corners of the earth settling in together to listen to the same old stories. And if this is your first time on the channel, please consider subscribing so you never miss another journey into the lore of this world we both love. Section 2. The Age of Heroes and Bran the Builder. Before there was a House Stark, before there was a Winterfell, before there was even a wall standing between the settled lands of Westeros and whatever lay beyond, there was a long night. Yet we need to start here because everything that makes the Starks who they are traces back to this one terrible season, this one prolonged darkness that descended over the world so long ago that it has passed out of recorded history and into the territory of legend. The long night was not a winter in the ordinary sense of the word, where the days grow short and the temperature drops and you put on an extra layer of wool and wait it out. The long night was a winter that lasted a generation, a winter in which the sun stopped rising for so long that people genuinely forgot what sunlight looked like, in which the cold became so absolute that it stopped being weather and started being a presence, something with intent, something malevolent, pushing down from the north and killing everything in its path. And with the darkness and the cold came something else, something that the old stories call the Others, and that the people of Westeros have been trying to forget about ever since. White Walkers, creatures of ice and magic and ancient cold, moving through the darkness with an army of the dead behind them, killing the living and raising them back up to serve as soldiers in a war that felt less like conquest and more like the systematic erasure of all warmth from the world. The details of what happened during the long night are lost to us now. The Meisters debate whether half of it actually occurred the way the legends say, whether the others were truly supernatural beings, or whether the whole thing has been mythologized beyond recognition after 8,000 years of retelling. But what seems to be true, or at least what the oldest fragments of record suggest, is that the long night happened, that it was catastrophic, and that humanity survived it only barely and only by fighting back. The fight against the darkness during the long night is the origin point of House Stark, though the Starks as a named house did not yet exist. What existed was a man whose name has passed through so many generations of retelling that by now it sounds more like a title than a name, more like a myth than a person. But the bones of the story are consistent enough, across enough different sources, that scholars believe he was real, or at least that some king of the early North was real, and that the legends attached to him are echoes of actual deeds. His name was Brandon. Brandon the Builder. Imagine what it meant to be alive in that time. And in the immediate aftermath of the long night, the darkness had lifted. Whatever the others were, they had been pushed back or defeated or sealed away. The legends are vague on the mechanism of victory. And in the books written centuries later, Meisters argue endlessly about whether the children of the forest used their magic to drive the others back. Whether some hero whose name has been swallowed by time drove a burning sword into something vital. Whether it was simply the eventual turning of the seasons, but the darkness receded, the sun came back, And the people who remained, the first men, the earliest human inhabitants of Westeros, who had crossed a now sunken land bridge from the east thousands of years before, were left to figure out how to prevent that from ever happening again. This is where Brandon the Builder enters the story. The legends say he was a young man of the North, a first man of extraordinary practical intelligence combined with something that sounds very much like magical ability, though whether that magic was his alone, or whether he had access to the knowledge and power of the children of the forest is unclear. What is clear is that Brandon understood something fundamental about what the Long Night had meant, that the darkness had come from the far north, and that some kind of barrier was needed between the inhabited world and whatever lay beyond. Not just a wall of stone or wood, which any enemy could scale or burn, something more absolute, something that would last. And in the wall that Brandon the Builder raised at the northernmost boundary of the world was and remains one of the most extraordinary constructions in all of recorded history. 700 feet tall, 300 miles long, made entirely of ice. Not ordinary ice that melts and refreezes and cracks under pressure, but something far more substantial, something that the legends say was imbued with magic so deep and ancient that it does not behave the way ordinary matter does. A wall that has stood for 8,000 years against every force imaginable, that has survived wars and wildfire and the slow grinding of time, that even experienced observers in later ages look at and feel something they can only describe as awe mixed with a quiet, wordless unease. According to the old ballads recorded by the Meister Childer in his work Winter's Kings, Brandon did not build the wall alone. He sought the assistance of the children of the forest, the ancient non-human inhabitants of Westeros who predated the first men by thousands of years, who worshipped the old gods through the carved faces in weirwood trees and who possessed a deep and intricate magic rooted in the living world. Brandon is said to have learned their language, the true tongue, old and difficult and full of sounds that human throats were not naturally shaped to produce, in order to communicate with them and ask for their help. They gave it. The wall went up with their magic woven through it, layer upon layer, so that it was not merely a physical barrier, but a magical one as well. Giants helped move the great blocks of ice. And those enormous creatures who still existed in the northern wilds at that time, and who could accomplish in an afternoon what would take a team of men a week. Whether any of this is literally true, whether Brandon personally negotiated with the children of the forest and directed giants in construction, is the kind of question that keeps Meisters employed and busy. George R.R. Martin himself has noted that Brandon the Builder is as far removed from the timeline of the main story as Noah or Gilgamesh is from our own time. Which means even the people in the world of ice and fire were working from legend, not from history, when they spoke of him. The truth has been buried under millennia of retelling. What matters is the impression that survives, that here was a man who looked at the greatest threat the world had ever faced and responded by building something designed to last forever. And then, having built the wall, Brandon the Builder turned around and built Winterfell. The seat of House Stark sits at the center of the North in more ways than one. Geographically, it occupies a strategic position along the Great North-South Road that would eventually become the King's Road, meaning that anyone moving armies through the north has to deal with Winterfell. But it also sits at the center of Stark identity in a deeper way than geography. The castle was built, according to legend, directly above a network of natural hot springs that run through the bedrock of the region, and these springs heat the castle from below. It is running through the walls and channels that Brandon allegedly designed himself, keeping Winterfell warmer than any castle built in such a cold climate had any right to be. Even in the deepest winters, the springs keep the pipes from freezing, keep the Great Hall inhabitable, keep the God's Wood, with its ancient heart tree, a weirwood with a carved face that stares out from the pale bark with red eyes that seem almost alive, from dying in the cold. Beneath the castle, carved out of the rock on which it stands, are the crypts. And the crypts are, in their own way, as important to understanding the Starks as anything above ground. They are old, very old, so old that the deepest levels are partially collapsed and have not been explored in living memory. And the statues that stand there in the darkness are worn so smooth by time that the faces have disappeared into featureless stone. But for thousands of years, every Stark lord and every king of winter has been carried down into those depths and laid to rest in a stone tomb with a stone wolf at their feet and an iron sword across their lap. The sword is not decorative. According to tradition old enough that no one alive quite remembers where it started, the swords are placed there to keep the spirits of the dead at rest, to keep them in their tombs. That tradition is very old and very northern, and it tells you something important about the relationship the Starks have always had with their dead. The dead are not simply gone, in the northern understanding of things. They persist. They remain near the place they knew in life. And if they are not held in place, they move. The dire wolves at the feet of the statues reinforce this, protection and restraint in the same gesture. We honor you. We keep you close, but we keep you still. When Bran Stark was a boy, he played in the crypts with Jon and Robb, the way children play in spaces their parents find unsettling, precisely because children have not yet learned which things are supposed to frighten them. He knew the names carved on the tombs, knew them better than he knew the names of anyone's servants or the layout of any room outside Winterfell, because these were his people, these stone figures in the dark. Their faces had been formed by the same hands, the same blood, the same cold that had formed his. They were not strangers, they were Stark's every one, and he had never feared them, all because they were part of his home and of who he was, and he had always known that one day he would lie here too. That is a remarkably accepting thing for a child to feel about death, and it is perhaps the most Stark thing about Bran. Not his eventual transformation into something far beyond human, not his supernatural gifts, but that basic northern understanding that the dead are ours and we are theirs, and the circle closes as it was always meant to. Brandon the Builder established more than a castle and a wall. He established a dynasty, and through that dynasty, a kingdom. The family that bore his name, the Starks of Winterfell, rose in the years and centuries following the Long Night to claim dominion over the North. They were not the only great family in the region at first. It's the North in those early years was a complicated patchwork of petty kingdoms and warring clans, each one claiming their own territory and resisting the claims of their neighbors. But the Starks had something none of the others had, a castle that could not be taken easily, a lineage tied to the most important act of defense in the world's history, and the accumulated prestige of 8,000 years of winters survived. They called themselves the Kings of Winter. It was a title that carried within it everything the Starks would always be. Not kings of warmth, not kings of plenty, but kings of the hardest thing, the coldest thing, the thing that stripped everything else away and left only what was necessary. They were rulers shaped by endurance, defined by their ability to survive what would destroy others. And in the centuries that followed, they would need every ounce of that capacity. Section 3. The Kings of Winter. 8,000 years of rule. 8,000 years is a number that is difficult to hold in your mind all at once. If you try to compress it into something manageable, you arrive at facts that feel more like science fiction than history. That the Stark dynasty is older than any surviving civilization in our own world. Older than Rome, older than Greece, older than the Egyptian pharaohs, older than almost anything you can name. When Eddard Stark walked the halls of Winterfell in the days before Game of Thrones begins, he was the custodian of a legacy that stretched back so far into time that the world it originated in bore almost no resemblance to the world he lived in. Yes, the Kings of Winter did not simply inherit a title and sit on it. The 8,000 years between Bran the Builder and the Targaryen conquest were not peaceful years. They were years of constant pressure from every direction, years of war and consolidation, and the slow, grinding work of bringing the North under unified rule. The most persistent and dangerous of the Stark rivals in those early centuries was House Bolton of the Dreadfor. The Boltons were to the Starks what a shadow is to a body, always present, always shaped by the same geography and conditions, but fundamentally different in character. Where the Starks built their identity around honor and the protection of their people, the Boltons built theirs around something darker and harder to look at directly. Their sigil was a flayed man, a human figure hanging upside down, stripped of skin, and this was not an empty gesture at menace. The Boltons flayed their enemies. They took the skins of the men they killed in battle and wore them as trophies, as cloaks, as declarations of what they were. One particularly feared Red King was known as Royce Redarm for his habit of plunging his arm into vanquished foes while they still lived. The Starks and the Boltons fought over the North for centuries. Winterfell was burned by Bolton armies more than once. The castle shows its history in its construction, the haphazard way new sections were added against old ones, the first keep that dates to a period of rebuilding after destruction, The reinforced walls and the additional guard towers and the expanded granaries all reflecting a history of sieges and recoveries and the stubborn Stark refusal to stay down. After each burning, the Starks rebuilt. After each defeat, they reorganized. The Boltons won battles. The Starks won the war, eventually, when a King of Winter defeated the Red King, and the Boltons bent the knee and became vassals to Winterfell, though they would prove to be vassals that always required watching. Beyond the Boltons, the Starks fought wars on every front. To the south, the Barrow Kings, ancient rulers of the barrows and burial mounds along the southeastern boundary of the north, resisted Stark expansion for generations before eventually submitting. To the east, beyond the White Knife River, various northern lords held their lands against Stark authority until the pressure of Winterfell's growing power became impossible to resist. To the west, the Ironborn of the Iron Islands raided the northern coastline, burning fishing villages and carrying people into thraldom with a casual efficiency that spoke to centuries of practice. The legends record fragments of these wars with the kind of vivid detail that tends to survive even when more mundane history dissolves. One particularly striking tale involves King Roderick Stark and the acquisition of Bear Island, that rocky, forested outcrop off the northwestern coast of the north that would eventually become the home of House Mormont. According to legend, Roderick Stark did not conquer Bear Island through military force. He won it in a wrestling match against an Ironborn chieftain who held the island at the time. Whether this is literally true or whether it is the kind of story that accretes around strong kings as they grow in legend, Bear Island became Stark territory and was given to the family of Mormont, who would hold it loyally for centuries. Another historical figure from the long saga of the Kings of Winter who deserves mention is Theon Stark, known in the histories as the Hungry Wolf, a king of such ferocious aggression and predatory energy that the name was carved onto his tomb not as a condemnation, but as an honor. Theon the Hungry Wolf repelled an Ironborn invasion of the North with a thoroughness that went beyond military victory into something closer to a declaration of principle. The North does not yield, and the cost of attacking it will always be higher than you calculated. Theon Greyjoy, the boy who grew up at Winterfell as a ward of Eddard Stark, and who would eventually betray everything that name represented, was named after this ancient King of Winter, a fact that carries its own layers of irony. There is also the question of the Night's King. This is one of the strangest and most troubling legends in the entire history of House Stark, and it is worth pausing on because it speaks to something important about the relationship between the Starks and the supernatural forces that surround the North. The Night's King was, according to the legend, the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, the ancient order of men who were established to guard the wall after it was built by Bran the Builder. He was a man of the Night's Watch who fell in love with a woman with ice-blue eyes and skin as pale as the moon, a woman who was not human, a woman who was other. And he brought her back to the Night Fort, the greatest and oldest and most forbidding of the Night's Watch castles, and declared himself king. For 13 years, the Night's King ruled the Night Fort with his pale queen beside him, and terrible things occurred during those years. Things that Old Nan would describe to the Stark children in a low voice, watching their eyes go wide in the firelight. Human sacrifices, people taken from villages and never returned, the men of the Night's Watch corrupted into something unrecognizable, and then a man named Brandon the Breaker, another Brandon, another Stark, but a different one. At generations removed from the Builder, united with a wildling king named Jorah Mormont to bring the Night's King down. The name of the Night's King was afterwards stripped from all records. His very name became unsayable, his history erased. Some sources, including the Stark household's own Old Nan, suggest the Night's King was himself a Stark, a brother of Brandon the Breaker, a man of the same blood who fell to something darker and who had to be destroyed by his own family. If this is true, and it is impossible to verify precisely because his name was erased, then it adds a layer of complexity to the Stark mythology that resonates through all 8,000 years and well into the final seasons of Game of Thrones. The idea that the greatest enemy ever produced by the North came from inside the family that protected the North. Yet that the battle between the living and the dead, between warmth and cold, between the world and the darkness beyond the wall, is not a battle between the Starks and something alien to them, but something closer to an internal struggle, a war between two sides of the same inheritance. Ice and fire, the builder and the destroyer, the wolf who protects the flock and the wolf who goes rogue, Old Nan, who kept these stories alive for the Stark children generation after generation, knew things about the deep history of the North that the Meisters had either forgotten or refused to believe. She had a way of ending stories about the Night's King with particular weight. Some say he was a Bolton, she would tell the children. Some say a Magnar out of Skagos. Some say Umber, Flint, or Nori. But he was a Stark. As the brother of the man who brought him down. And the fire in the great hall of Winterfell would crackle, and the children would pull their blankets a little tighter, and outside the window the North would be doing what it always does. Watching, waiting, cold and patient, and full of things that have not been named yet. The Starks survived all of this. They survived the Boltons and the Barrow Kings and the Ironborn Raiders and the legend of the Night's King, and 8,000 years of winters that would have broken any other house in the world. They survived because they understood something that later softer rulers in the South forgot. That survival is not about being invincible. It is about being adaptable, about knowing when to fight and when to endure, about understanding that the cold does not care about your pride. Winter is coming, and it is always coming, and the only way to face it is to already be ready. By the time the Andal invasion swept over Westeros from the east, roughly 6,000 years before the main events of Game of Thrones, the Starks were already ancient. They were already legendary. They had already been kings of winter for so long that their origin story had passed from history into something that felt more like the world's creation myth. Bran the Builder, not just a man, but a figure of the deep past, part of the fabric of everything that came after. Section 4. The North that held. The Andal invasion and Northern identity. To understand what makes the North different from everything south of the Neck, you have to understand what happened when the Andals came. As the Andals were a people from across the narrow sea, from a region of Essos that they called Ondalos, a place sanctified in their belief system, a homeland they believed had been given to them by the 7 gods they worshipped: the Father, the Mother, the Warrior, the Maiden, the Crone, the Smith, and the Stranger. They were tall and fair-haired in many cases, skilled in ironworking, organized around a faith that gave them not only a spiritual framework, but a political and social one. The faith of the 7, with its septons and septas and its great sept in what would eventually become King's Landing, was not merely a religion but an institution, a parallel power structure that the Andal kings and lords learned to work with and around. And the Andals invaded Westeros in enormous numbers, roughly 6,000 years ago, and swept through the continent like a tide, crushing or absorbing the First Men kingdoms one by one. They were not simply conquerors in the military sense, they were cultural replacers. When the Andals took a region, they cut down the weirwood trees, those pale trees with carved faces that the First Men used as focal points for their worship of the old gods. They introduced the 7. They intermarried with the First Men nobility, so that within a few generations the distinction between Andal and First Men blood was blurring at the edges. They brought their laws and their sept architecture and their Andal names. And over the centuries, the First Men identity south of the Neck faded, until it was more a genealogical fact than a living cultural practice. But the Andals never took the North. There are practical reasons for this. The Neck, that narrow watery bottleneck of swamp and marsh and rivers between the North and the rest of the continent, is one of the most defensible geographical features in all of Westeros. The castle of Moat Cailin stands at the heart of the Neck, and it is not merely a castle, but a maze of towers and ditches and waterways controlled by the Crannogmen, the small, secretive, swamp-dwelling people of House Reed, who know every hidden path through the wetlands and who have defended the passage into the North for as long as anyone can remember. Getting an army through the Neck without the cooperation of the North is genuinely difficult, and the Andals who tried found themselves bogged down and harassed and eventually discouraged. But there is also a cultural reason. And this one matters more in the long run. The North had something the South did not have, a memory of the long night and everything that built the wall and established the Night's Watch and gave the Starks their purpose. In the South, the weirwood trees were cut down, the faces were destroyed, the connection to the old gods was severed. But in the North, the trees still stood. The great white trunks with their red-veined leaves and their carved faces still watched over every god's wood and every holdfast from Winterfell to the Wall. The practice of the old faith, older than the Andals, Balmo, older than the First Men's arrival in Westeros, older than almost everything that could be named, remained alive in the North in a way it did not anywhere else. and the Starks were its keepers. Yes, the Starks prayed in the godswood of Winterfell before its heart tree, an ancient weirwood whose face had been carved so long ago that no living person knew which hands had done it. They executed their condemned men themselves, personally, because in the old tradition, the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword, not because it is comfortable or impressive, but because it demands accountability. The Lord does not abstract himself from the hard things. The Lord looks the person he is killing in the eyes, and he carries that weight himself. This practice, which Eddard Stark held to so deeply that he explained it to his sons as a foundational lesson in what it means to hold power, was not simply a Stark eccentricity. It was a surviving expression of an 8,000-year-old understanding of what leadership was for. You serve the land and the people. You do not hide from the consequences of your authority. The sword does not do the killing. You do, and you have to know that, and carry it. There is something in this tradition that tells you more about the northern character than almost anything else. The Lords of the South developed mechanisms for putting distance between themselves and the raw reality of what power required. They had executioners. They had institutions. They had the comfortable machinery of governance that did the hard, blood-wet work, while the Lord watched from a height or did not watch at all. The Starks refused that distance. The Stark Lord looked the condemned man in the eyes and swung the blade himself, and rode home carrying the knowledge of what he had done. This was not cruelty. It was the opposite of cruelty. Or at least it was intended to be. You do not take a life lightly when you are the one who has to take it personally. You do not sentence people carelessly when you know your hand will swing the sword. The gravity of judgment falls differently on a man who cannot abstract himself from its consequences. The godswood at Winterfell, that grove of weirwood trees within the castle walls, the heart tree with its carved face watching the place where the Starks prayed, was the center of all of this, the physical expression of the relationship between the family and the thing older than them that they were trying to honor. The children of the forest had carved the faces in the weirwood trees thousands of years before the first men arrived in Westeros, and when the first men made peace with the children after centuries of war, as part of the agreement was that the first men would preserve the weirwoods and the sacred groves and worship the forces that lived within them. The Starks honored this pact without interruption for 8,000 years. They kept faith with something older than civilization, and in doing so, they kept something alive in the North that had died everywhere else. There is a patience in that fidelity that is almost impossible to fully appreciate unless you sit with it long enough to feel the weight of it. Generation after generation of Stark lords, living and ruling and dying and being carried down into the crypts, had maintained the same relationship to the same trees and the same gods and the same cold land, and that continuity was not simply tradition for tradition's sake. It was the visible, daily, embodied expression of a covenant, an agreement between the Stark bloodline and the oldest living things in Westeros, an agreement that said, "We will not forget you. We will not replace you with something newer and more comfortable. We will hold faith even when nobody is watching, even when the world has moved on, even when the Southerners laugh at us for still whispering to trees. The trees remember. We remember. That is enough." Whether there was something genuinely supernatural in those carved faces, whether the old gods were real, in the way that the Red Priests claimed R'hllor was real, present and responsive, and capable of acting in the world, is a question the series never fully resolves. What is certain is that the Weirwood network was real, that it transmitted information across vast distances through its roots, that the children of the forest had woven magic into it that persisted long after most of them were gone, and that certain individuals with the right kind of blood and the right kind of openness could reach through it and see. The Greenseers of the Children of the Forest had used it, the Three-Eyed Raven used it, and Bran Stark, the last of his kind, would ultimately use it to see everything that had ever happened and everything that would matter. All of that inheritance, the weirwoods, the old gods, the carved face watching from the pale bark, the connection to something deeper and older than kingdoms or dynasties, came through the Stark line precisely because the North had held against the Andal invasion. The Andals never broke through the neck in force. The North remained First Men territory. Yet the Starks remained the ruling family of a kingdom that kept the old ways, worshipped the old gods, and maintained an identity distinct from everything that was happening south of the swamp. even when the faith of the Seven eventually spread northward in later centuries. When Eddard Stark would build a sept at Winterfell for his southern wife, Catelyn Tully, who could not pray in a godswood without the training to know what to listen for, the North remained fundamentally old gods' country. There were no great septs north of the Neck. The religion of the Andals was accommodated as a courtesy to Southerners who happened to live there, but it was not the heartbeat of the place. The heartbeat of the place was older than that. It was the trees. What this means in practice is that the North, and by the time Aegon Targaryen arrived to conquer Westeros, roughly 300 years before the main events of Game of Thrones, was a place that had been under the same family for 8,000 years, following the same gods for 8,000 years, insisting on the same culture for 8,000 years. The bannermen of House Stark, houses like Umber and Mormont and Bolton and Karstark and Reed and Manderley, were all first men or descendants of the Andal first men, mixing that had happened in the southernmost parts of the North. And they all answered to Winterfell, even when answering to Winterfell was inconvenient or uncomfortable or potentially dangerous. Because that is the other thing about the North that distinguishes it from everywhere else. The loyalty there is real, not the performance of loyalty, not the carefully calculated alliance that you hold as long as it suits you, and abandon when it stops. Real loyalty, the kind that comes from a shared history so long and so heavy that it has stopped being a choice and started being something closer to identity. When a Northman says the Stark name, there is something in his chest that responds to it the way a compass responds to north. Not because anyone told him to feel that way, but because 8,000 years of shared history have made it as natural as breathing. Winter is coming. We protect each other. We do not forget. The North remembers. Section 5. Torrhen Stark. The king who knelt. The Targaryen conquest of Westeros began in roughly the second year before Aegon's coronation, which the Masters use as their calendar reference point for the entire subsequent era. And Aegon Targaryen landed on the eastern coast of the continent with his two sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, and roughly 1,600 soldiers, a number so small it seems almost comical when set against the forces arrayed across 6 kingdoms. What made the difference? What transformed this modest expedition into the founding event of a 300-year dynasty was 3 things: Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar, and Meraxes. 3 dragons, the largest the world had ever seen, the most destructive weapons ever deployed in the history of human warfare, creatures that could turn an army to ash in minutes and against which no shield wall or fortified position or tactical genius could avail anything at all. The kingdoms of the south fell one by one. House Gardener of the Reach was wiped out at the Field of Fire when Aegon deployed all 3 dragons simultaneously against the combined army of the Reach and the Rock. 4,000 men burned to death in a single engagement, and the heirs of a dynasty that had ruled for thousands of years consumed along with them. Harren the Black's enormous new castle of Harrenhal, which he had spent decades constructing on the shores of the God's Eye, and which he believed to be impregnable, was melted into twisted ruin in an afternoon, as Balerion the Black Dread breathed fire directly through its towers, turning stone to glass and the men inside to cinders. King Rhaenel Arryn of the Vale, a young boy at the time, watched from his mother's arms as Visenya landed her dragon in his castle's courtyard and agreed to submit rather than experience what every other ruler who had defied Aegon had experienced. And then word reached Torrhen Stark that the Dragon Lords of Dragonstone had conquered everything south of the Neck, and Torrhen called his banners. He assembled an army of 30,000 men, a significant force as large as anything the North could field on short notice, and marched them south across the Neck and into the Riverlands to meet Aegon at the Trident. 30,000 Northmen, hardened by the cold, loyal to their king, prepared to defend their independence with everything they had. When Torrhen arrived at the Trident, he found Aegon waiting for him with a Targaryen host half again the size of his own. Plus the forces of every kingdom that had already submitted, the Lords of the Reach and the Rock and the Stormlands and the Vale, all marching under Targaryen banners now, a combined army drawn from half a continent. And above them, circling in the sky, 3 dragons. Torrhen looked at the numbers, and then he looked at the sky, and he thought about Harrenhal. He thought about the Field of Fire. He thought about 4,000 men burning in a matter of minutes, about stone melting under the sustained heat of Balerion's breath. about what that same fire would do to 30,000 Northmen standing in an open field. Yes, his bastard brother Jon Snow offered to cross the river at night and try to kill the dragons where they slept. A bold and desperate plan that spoke to how seriously Torrhen was taking the threat and how unwilling he was to simply accept the inevitable. Torrhen refused Brandon's offer. The killing of 3 dragons was not something one man could accomplish. And even if it could, the attempt failing would mean the deaths of 30,000 men and the burning of the north and the end of everything. Torrhen sent Brandon across the river instead with 3 Meisters and an offer to negotiate. Messages went back and forth through the night. Terms were discussed, conditions were set. And in the morning, Torrhen Stark, the last king in the north, yet the carrier of a title that had been held by his family for 8,000 years, rode his horse south across the Trident, dismounted in front of Aegon the Conqueror, knelt in the mud, and laid the ancient crown of the Kings of Winter at Aegon's feet. He rose as a king no more, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, a vassal of the Iron Throne. The North remembers this event with a complexity that is difficult to fully capture. On one hand, Torrhen has been called the king who knelt for 300 years after his death, and some Northmen say the title with contempt, the way you would say coward. On the other hand, and this is the calculation that Torrhen himself clearly made, and that his descendants have consistently defended, Torrhen's choice saved 30,000 lives that day, as the armies of the Reach and the Rocks did not save those lives. They died screaming on the field of fire because their kings were too proud to bend. Harren the Black and all his family and all his household died inside melting walls because Harren could not conceive of a world in which his power was insufficient. Torrhen could conceive of it. He looked at the evidence and he made the calculation, and he accepted a wound to his pride in exchange for the survival of his people. His descendants are alive to say the name with contempt precisely because he made this choice. The Northmen who sneer at the king who knelt are alive to sneer because their ancestor bent his knee. Robb Stark, centuries later, would have exactly this conversation with his bannermen, making exactly this argument. And Sansa Stark in the final seasons of the show, this would make it again. The Starks understand what Torrhen did. They do not all admire it, but they understand it. What followed the kneeling was not comfortable, but it was survivable. Aegon named Torrhen the first Lord of Winterfell under Targaryen rule, and confirmed the Starks as rulers of the North in everything except name. Their culture, their religion, their laws, all of these remained as they had been. The Targaryens were not interested in cultural homogenization in the North. They were interested in submission and in the tax revenue and the military service that submission entailed. The Starks provided both, and in exchange, they kept Winterfell, kept the old gods, kept their way of life. Torrhen's sons were not happy about the arrangement. Just there are letters preserved in the Citadel at Old Town, suggesting that Torrhen's sons discussed the possibility of rebellion multiple times in the years immediately after the conquest, that they refused to attend the marriage that Queen Rhaenys arranged between Torrhen's daughter and the Lord of the Eyrie as a gesture of reconciliation between the North and the Vale. The sons of the king who knelt had inherited their father's stubbornness without inheriting his pragmatism, which is perhaps the most natural thing in the world. It is always easier to wish a different choice had been made when you are not the one who had to make it. But the rebellion never came. The Starks swallowed their pride and served their Targaryen overlords with the same dogged northern reliability that they brought to everything else. And for 300 years, they waited. Not in resentment, or not primarily in resentment, but with the awareness, always present somewhere beneath the daily business of governance and seasonal harvest, and the slow accumulation of northern weather, that they had once been kings. That the crown their family had worn for 8,000 years was now gone, taken away by fire, and by a choice that Torrhen himself had admitted was the only possible choice, but which remained forever and ever the choice that cost the most. Section 6, or 3 centuries as wardens, Cregan Stark, and the Hour of the Wolf. The 300 years between Aegon's conquest and the beginning of Game of Thrones were not uneventful for the Starks, but they were years of a different kind of drama than what had come before. Years of political navigation rather than existential struggle. Years of managing the complex relationship between a deeply independent northern culture and the increasingly complex political world of the Seven Kingdoms. In the early years after the conquest, the relationship between the Starks and the Iron Throne was, as we noted, strained. The sons of Torrhen who wanted to rebel did not rebel, and the family slowly found a working equilibrium with their Targaryen overlords. But the relationships between Winterfell and King's Landing were never entirely easy. When King Jaehaerys I and his beloved Queen Alysanne visited the north, roughly 50 years after the conquest, a diplomatic tour designed to strengthen ties between the throne and its northern vassals, there were tensions from the start. The Lord of Winterfell at the time, Alaric Stark, was initially cold to the royal couple, and in part because Jaehaerys had made a decision regarding Night's Watch deserters that Alaric felt had cost his brother his life. Alysanne won over the frosty Northmen gradually, through charm and genuine interest, and the kind of warmth that overcomes suspicion, not through argument, but through sustained presence. She flew her dragon Silverwing over the wall to visit the Night's Watch, the first Targaryen queen to see the wall from its northern side, and was moved by the poverty and isolation of the brothers there, and arranged to give them a significant grant of land south of the wall to help support their operations. This land became known as the New Gift, and it was a meaningful gesture of royal commitment to the institution that the Starks had always supported, but it also created its own resentments. Because the land given as the New Gift had to come from somewhere, and the northern lords whose families had held that land for generations were not pleased to be dispossessed, however noble the cause. The relationship between the Starks and the Targaryens over the following centuries was full of these small friction points. These moments where the interests of Winterfell and King's Landing rubbed against each other in ways that required management and compromise, and the occasional swallowed objection. Through all of this, the Starks held their identity. They kept the old gods. They kept the customs of the first men. They kept the practice of personal execution. The lord who passes the sentence must swing the sword, and the burial of the dead in the crypts beneath Winterfell. Since the statues standing in the darkness with their iron swords and their stone wolves, generation upon generation, going to their rest in the same rock their ancestors had rested in for 8,000 years. The most dramatic Stark appearance in the Targaryen era before the events of Game of Thrones itself comes about 150 years after the conquest, during the civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. The dance was the Targaryen Civil War, a brutal conflict over succession that tore the Seven Kingdoms in half and resulted in the deaths of nearly every dragon the Targaryens possessed. On one side, Rhaenyra Targaryen, daughter of the late King Viserys I, who had been formally named heir to the Iron Throne by her father in a ceremony that every great lord in the realm had attended and sworn to honor. On the other side, Aegon II, Rhaenyra's younger half-brother, backed by their mother's family and the conservative faction of the court, who argued that a woman could not sit the Iron Throne. Two legitimate claims, two armed factions, and a kingdom set on fire between them. When Rhaenyra's oldest surviving son, Jacaerys Velaryon, set out on his dragon to secure allies for his mother's cause, one of his destinations was Winterfell. The Lord of Winterfell at that time was Cregan Stark. He was young. He had taken lordship of Winterfell at the age of 13, after his father died, and he had spent a significant portion of his young life in conflict with his uncle Bernard, who had been slow to surrender the regency when Cregan came of age. Since Cregan had resolved this dispute by imprisoning his uncle and taking control of Winterfell by force, which tells you something about the man he was going to become. Not a man who waited patiently for power to arrive at his door. Not a man who relied on the goodwill of others to restore what was his. A man who acted. When Jacaerys Velaryon arrived at Winterfell on his dragon to make his case for Rhaenyra, Cregan took him to the top of the wall and gave him a history lesson. He pointed down from that enormous height at the dark northern wilderness below and explained what it meant to maintain the wall, what the Night's Watch required, and how his ancestor Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, had understood something about the reason Aegon Targaryen had really come to conquer Westeros. Not merely ambition, not merely the hunger for power, but the dream Aegon had, the dream that told him the Seven Kingdoms needed to be unified against a threat from the north that would otherwise destroy them all. Torrhen had known this, and the Starks had been sending their men to the wall ever since, 1 in every 10 members of the household, a tradition Cregan described as not just obligation, but sacred duty. Cregan agreed to support Rhaenyra's cause. He sent Northmen south in 2 waves, first a vanguard under a trusted lord, men who were old or homeless or had no families, men who marched to war, knowing it was likely their last march and accepting that, then, a larger force that Cregan himself would eventually lead. These became known as the Winter Wolves, northern warriors fighting a southern war, making the long march down the King's Road into a world entirely unlike the one they knew. By the time Cregan and his army reached King's Landing, the war was essentially over. Rhaenyra had already died. Aegon II had already died, likely poisoned by his own supporters who recognized the war was lost. The fighting was finished, and the political settlement was being worked out. But Cregan Stark arrived at King's Landing with a northern army and a fierce, legally minded fury about the way the ending had been handled, and he refused to accept that the murder of a king by his own people was something that could just be waved away in the interest of peace. For 6 days, Cregan Stark held the Red Keep and dispensed justice in the name of the new young king. 22 men were arrested for their roles in Aegon's death. Most chose to take the Black, to join the Night's Watch rather than face execution. It's a choice Cregan accepted because it served the Wall, even as it technically spared their lives. 2 chose death and were executed. Cregan served as Hand of the King for exactly 1 day, long enough to complete the trials, then resigned the office and returned north. This episode became known as the Hour of the Wolf, and it is remembered as one of the finest moments in Stark history, a demonstration that the Starks' adherence to law and honor was not merely a personal style, but a genuine principle that they would enforce even when doing so was inconvenient, even when the war was over, and it would have been easier to simply accept the political reality and go home. Cregan Stark went home eventually, but not before making sure that the law had been served. He ruled the North for decades afterward, and came to be called the Old Man of the North, living long enough that he crossed swords with Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight in his later years, and was said by that greatest of swordsmen to be the finest he had ever faced. When Cregan Stark died, he was carried to the crypts beneath Winterfell and laid to rest with his iron sword and his stone wolf, another link in the long chain of Stark lords whose faces stared out from the stone in the dark below the castle. And the centuries continued. More lords succeeded each other, more winters came and went. The Night's Watch slowly declined, its membership shrinking, its purpose increasingly dismissed by a southern nobility that had never seen the Wall and could not quite believe in the threat it was built to guard against. The Starks kept sending men. It kept maintaining the tradition Torrhen had begun after his conversation with Aegon's dream, kept watching the North with the patient, habitual vigilance of people who had been watching it for 8,000 years, until the generation of Rickard Stark, and everything changed. Section 7. Rickard Stark, the tournament at Harrenhal, and the spark of rebellion. Rickard Stark was, by all accounts, an intelligent and forward-thinking lord. Where previous Stark lords had been content to be the unchallenged rulers of a northern kingdom that everyone else found vaguely exotic and difficult to reach, Rickard had ambitions of a different kind, not for conquest or for power in the Targaryen court, but for integration, for connection, both for the building of alliances that would give the North more influence in the realm than it had ever had through sheer isolation. He arranged marriages with that goal explicitly in mind. His son Brandon was betrothed to Catelyn Tully of River Run, daughter of the Lord Paramount of the Trident, a significant southern alliance that would bind the North to the Riverlands and give Rickard influence far south of the Neck. His daughter Lyanna was betrothed to Robert Baratheon, the young and enormously energetic heir to Storm's End, a man of great physical power and greater charisma who was shaping up to be one of the most significant lords in the Southern Kingdoms. Rickard sent his second son Eddard to be fostered at the Eyrie with Jon Arryn, one of the most respected lords in the realm, where Ned became close friends with Jon's other ward, Robert Baratheon himself. This was deliberate. Rickard wanted his sons to know the South, to have friends there, to be people of consequence in the larger world of the Seven Kingdoms, rather than simply the lords of a very large, very cold, very far away place. It was a coherent strategy. It was working. And then, in the year of the great tournament of Harrenhal, everything began to come apart in ways that Rickard could not have predicted or controlled. The tournament at Harrenhal was the largest tournament in living memory, a gathering of essentially every significant lord and their households, thousands of knights competing before an audience drawn from all 7 kingdoms. It was magnificent and chaotic and deeply, fatally entangled in the politics of the moment. King Aerys II, the Mad King, though he was not yet fully mad, or at least not yet fully acknowledged as such, attended, and his presence brought its own crackling tension to every interaction. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the heir to the Iron Throne, also attended. He was, by universal agreement, extraordinary. Tall and silver-haired, with purple eyes that seemed to look through whatever they were looking at rather than merely at it, skilled with the sword and the harp in equal measure, possessed of an intelligence and a gravity that inspired devotion in almost everyone he encountered. He was everything a prince was supposed to be, and the question of whether he would manage his father's increasingly unstable reign with the grace and wisdom it required was one that preoccupied every thoughtful person in the realm. Rhaegar won the tournament. He rode through the final joust and unhorsed his last opponent, and should, at that point, have ridden to where his wife Elia Martell sat and crowned her queen of love and beauty, in the ceremonial gesture that ended every tournament. Instead, he rode past his wife, rode slowly through the crowd in a silence that deepened as people understood what was happening, and stopped in front of Lyanna Stark, and placed the wreath of blue winter roses in her lap. Elia Martell, pregnant with Rhaegar's second child, sat where she was. The crowd stared, and somewhere in the middle of all those watching faces, Robert Baratheon, Lyanna's betrothed, the man she was meant to marry, felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with winter. Nobody knew what it meant. Everyone suspected something. As the interpretations multiplied in the weeks and months that followed, and by the time Rhaegar and Lyanna disappeared together, whether as a kidnapping, as it appeared to everyone who did not know the truth, or as an elopement, as it actually was, the situation had already become impossible to manage. Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother and the heir to Winterfell, was the kind of man who did everything at full speed, with full conviction and very little patience for the slower, more careful approach. He was Lyanna's brother. Oh, and when he heard that Rhaegar Targaryen had taken her away, had ridden through a tournament, and essentially claimed her in front of her betrothed, and then made off with her, Brandon's response was to ride directly to King's Landing with a company of friends and stand outside the Red Keep and shout for Rhaegar to come out and face him. It was a bold gesture. It was, in its own way, entirely Stark, direct, personal, refusing to route the confrontation through channels when a direct confrontation was available. And it was catastrophically wrong, in a way that Brandon could not have anticipated, because he was dealing not with Rhaegar, but with Aerys. Aerys II had not always been the Mad King. Once he had been promising, charming even. But over the long years of his reign, is punctuated by a traumatic captivity during a rebellion that had left psychological wounds that never healed. Aerys had drifted into something that combined paranoia with cruelty, and that found its most terrifying expression in fire. Aerys loved fire. He kept a pyromancer at court. He had caches of wildfire, a magically produced, essentially inextinguishable substance that burned green and could not be put out with water. Hidden beneath King's Landing, he burned people. His sexual relationship with his own sister wife Rhaella had deteriorated into something monstrous, something that intensified on nights when he had watched someone burn. When Brandon Stark stood outside the Red Keep and demanded Rhaegar come out, Aerys had him arrested. Not for any clear legal reason, but because Aerys had been seeing conspiracies everywhere for years. And here was evidence of one, a powerful Northern Lord's heir, shouting sedition outside the gates. Aerys had Brandon chained. Then, in an act of staggering royal arrogance, he sent a raven to Rickard Stark, demanding that Rickard come south to pay ransom for his treasonous son. Rickard came. He came because he had been given what appeared to be the opportunity to resolve the situation through negotiation, and because the alternative, refusing a royal summons, was itself potentially treasonous. He arrived at King's Landing assuming he would face some kind of trial, some kind of formal process. He demanded his right as a lord to a trial by combat. Aerys agreed. Rickard Stark was armored for battle. He was taken to the throne room, and Aerys declared that fire was the champion of House Targaryen. Rickard was suspended from the rafters in his armor. Aerys's pyromancer lit a fire beneath him. Rickard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, was slowly cooked to death in his own armor in the throne room of King's Landing, while the court watched in silence. His son Brandon, bound with a Teroshi strangling device, was made to watch his father die. A sword was placed just beyond Brandon's reach. In his efforts to reach the sword, Brandon strangled himself. 500 people were in the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody lifted a finger. Among those present was Sir Jaime Lannister, a young member of the King's Guard, who would remember that room for the rest of his life, and who would eventually act where no one else had. The news reached the north, and then reached Jon Arryn at the Eyrie, where Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon were both staying as his wards. Aerys demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of both young men. Jon Arryn, a man who had sworn to protect them, refused. He raised his banners instead, and Robert's rebellion began. Section 8. Ned Stark. Honor, a promise, and the Game of Thrones. Eddard Stark was not supposed to be Lord of Winterfell. He was the second son, the quiet one, the less obviously impressive one, the one who had been sent away to foster in the south, while his older brother Brandon stayed home and learned to carry the weight of the lordship and the heir's expectations. Brandon was the one who rode fast and spoke boldly and laughed easily. And Ned was the one who thought carefully before speaking, and who held his feelings so close to himself that even people who had known him for years sometimes found him unreadable. When Robert Baratheon described his friend Ned to others, and Robert talked about Ned often, with the particular tenderness that very outgoing people sometimes have for their quieter, more constant companions, he used words like honest and stubborn and good, not glamorous words, not words that summon visions of heroes on horseback. But the words Robert used with the most feeling, the most unmistakable affection, were these. Ned was the best man he had ever known. Not the most skilled, not the most powerful, the best. Ned fought in Robert's rebellion alongside the rebels, Jon Arryn and Robert and the Tully family, which had joined when Ned agreed to marry Catelyn, Brandon's former betrothed, and Jon Arryn agreed to marry Lysa Tully. He fought well, though his greatest contributions to the rebellion were perhaps less the battles he won than the decisions he made in the spaces between battles, the choices that reflected who he actually was. When the rebels won, when Robert killed Rhaegar at the Battle of the Trident, driving his warhammer through the rubies of Rhaegar's breastplate and sending them scattering across the water like seeds, the image that would haunt everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. Ned rode for King's Landing. When he arrived, he found that Tywin Lannister had already sacked the city. The Lannister soldiers had been let in on the pretense of reinforcement and had instead massacred. Among the dead were Rhaegar's wife, Elia Martell, and her children, babies, murdered in their cradles by soldiers under the command of Gregor Clegane. The Targaryen flags had been replaced by Lannister ones. And in the throne room, on the Iron Throne itself, sat Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, with the Mad King's cooling body at his feet. Ned looked at that scene and made the harshest possible moral judgment, the one that Jaime Lannister would carry with him for decades, and that would corrode their relationship completely. What Jaime Lannister had actually done was save 500,000 lives, had killed a man who was ordering the incineration of the entire city with wildfire, but Ned did not know that. And even when he later found out, he could not fully let go of what he had seen. A Kingsguard knight sitting on the throne over his dead king, an oathbreaker. It was the wrong frame for what was actually a desperate act of moral courage, and Ned's inability to look past it was one of the smaller ways in which his honor sometimes failed to serve him. But Ned rode away from King's Landing before Robert arrived and went south to Dorne. He went because his sister was there. Lyanna Stark was in the Tower of Joy, in the Red Mountains of Dorne, guarded by 3 members of the Targaryen Kingsguard. The final 3, the ones who had not gone to battle but had stayed here at this tower, because Rhaegar had commanded it. Ned fought them with Howland Reed and a small party of Northmen. The battle was terrible. Sir Arthur Dayne was perhaps the finest swordsman who had ever lived, the Sword of the Morning. And Ned did not beat him fairly. Howland Reed stabbed Dayne from behind when Dayne was about to kill Ned, and Ned won through a desperate pragmatism that contradicted everything his honor was supposed to stand for, but that was the only way to win. And inside the tower, Ned found his sister. Lyanna Stark had not been kidnapped. She had gone willingly because she was in love with Rhaegar Targaryen and Rhaegar was in love with her. And they had been secretly married by a High Septon before Rhaegar went to fight in the war. She had given birth to their son, and she was dying, bleeding out in a bed of red, in a room full of wilting winter roses, with her brother holding her hands and her eyes going dimmer. She pressed the infant into Ned's arms. She told him the boy's name, Aegon Targaryen. She told him who the child was. She told him that Robert would kill the child if he knew. Robert, who had declared his intention to exterminate every living Targaryen, who had been raging about it since the death of Rhaegar, who would not make an exception for a baby. She looked at her brother with what remaining strength she had, and she said, "Promise me, Ned." And Ned promised. He carried that promise home to Winterfell, disguised in one of the most costly lies a man of his particular character could have told. He presented the infant as his bastard son, a child he had supposedly fathered during the war on some woman whose name he would not say, and raised the boy alongside his own children, as Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell. He allowed his honor to take the wound of seeming to have been unfaithful to Catelyn. He let his wife believe he had betrayed her, because the alternative was telling anyone the truth, and the truth was a death sentence for a baby he had promised to protect. For 15 years, Ned Stark carried this secret. He told no one, not Catelyn, not Robert, not Jon himself. He told the story every day through silence, through the consistency of his lie, through the visible pain on Catelyn's face every time she looked at the boy whose existence she could not explain and could not forgive. He wore his honor like a suit of armor, as Cersei Lannister would later say. And underneath the armor, he was keeping the most important secret in Westeros. The years at Winterfell were the years Ned should have had the most of. His family was there, Catelyn and Robb and Sansa and Arya and Bran and Rickon, all of them living at Winterfell, the castle warm above the springs. Yet the gods would quiet in the mornings before the rest of the household was awake. Jon Snow was there too, always slightly outside the family, in the way that only he and Catelyn felt acutely, though for different reasons. They were years of harsh winters survived and warm summers briefly enjoyed, of children learning to ride and shoot and fight and read, of a lord and his lady governing a vast territory with the combination of firmness and care that the North required. And then Robert Baratheon rode up the King's Road to Winterfell, and everything Ned had built shattered. Robert came with the Lannister Queen Cersei and their children, and half the court, and he came with a request that Ned could not find a way to refuse. "Come to King's Landing, Ned. Be my hand. Jon Arryn is dead, murdered." Though nobody said that at first. And I need someone I can trust. Someone who won't lie to me. Someone who knows how to govern, rather than just how to scheme. The kingdom is in debt. I don't understand the money. I need you. Ned did not want to go. Ned saw King's Landing the way the North sees everything south of the Neck, as a dangerous, dishonest, complicated place where the rules he believed in did not apply, and where people who played the Game of Thrones were always operating at 3 layers of intention beneath what they were saying. He was not suited for that world. He knew he was not suited for it. Catelyn could see it. Even Robert could see it, though Robert wanted so badly for his friend to come that he refused to acknowledge the obvious. But Ned went, because Robert asked, because it was Robert. Because the loyalty between them was the kind of loyalty that does not know how to say no. It killed him. In King's Landing, Ned discovered the truth about why Jon Arryn had been murdered. Jon had been investigating the parentage of Cersei Lannister's children, the golden-haired, blue-eyed children she had presented to Robert as his heirs. Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen were not Robert's. They were the children of Cersei and her twin brother Jaime. The incest was an open secret among those close enough to court to see it clearly, but it had never been officially acknowledged. And the reason it had never been acknowledged was that acknowledging it would mean Joffrey had no claim to the throne, and Cersei would do anything, kill anyone, to protect her son's path to power. Ned found out. He confronted Cersei privately. He gave her the opportunity to take her children and flee before he told Robert. It was, by any Game of Thrones calculus, a catastrophically naive thing to do. You do not warn the person who has murdered one of your predecessors in the role you are now filling. You do not give someone who has demonstrated they will kill to preserve their secrets another opportunity to kill. But Ned gave Cersei the warning because he believed, genuinely in his bones, that an honorable man offers his enemy the chance to choose the right thing before he forces the consequences. Robert died before Ned could tell him. A hunting accident, engineered by Cersei's allies, reduced Robert from the barrel-chested king to a dying man in a feather bed, gasping out his regrets to the friend who was trying to figure out how to minimize the bloodshed of what was about to happen. Ned was betrayed. The gold cloaks of the City Watch, who he had paid in good faith to follow his instructions, turned against him at the critical moment on the orders of their commander Janos Slynt, who had been bribed by the Lannisters. Littlefinger, who Ned had trusted as an ally, put a knife to his throat instead. His household was killed. He was taken prisoner. In the dungeons, Ned was offered a deal by Varys, speaking on behalf of the Lannister cause. Confess to treason. Name Joffrey king. In exchange, his life would be spared. He would go to the Wall, which was considered mercy by Lannister standards. Ned refused at first, then Sansa begged him. Then Varys told him his daughter Sansa's life depended on it. And Ned Stark, who had worn his honor like armor his entire life, agreed to lie. Agreed to stand in front of the great sept of Baelor and confess to treason he had not committed in order to save his daughter. He made the confession. He named Joffrey king. He surrendered his pride and his honor and his name on the steps of the sept, in front of the whole city, in front of his daughters, and in front of history. And Joffrey, because Joffrey was Joffrey, had him executed anyway. Ned Stark knelt. He closed his eyes. He thought, perhaps, of Winterfell, and the children, and the gods' wood, and the stone statues in the dark. And the sword fell. He was 41 years old. Section 9. The Fall of House Stark. The War of Five Kings and the Red Wedding. When the news of Ned Stark's execution reached the north, it arrived like an ice storm, sudden, as total, and transformative. A lord does not get beheaded in the capital by the king he serves. It does not happen, or it does not happen like this, in front of crowds, without trial, without any of the forms of law that Eddard Stark had believed in and tried to use and died for. It was not just a political act. It was a violation of everything the Starks and the North stood for, a declaration by the new regime that the old rules no longer applied. Robb Stark was 17 years old, an acting Lord of Winterfell when his father was killed. He called his banners. The Northern Lords answered. They rode into Winterfell's yard with their household soldiers and their banners flying. The Umber Giants and the Mormont Bears and the Glover and Hornwood and Karstark men, all the houses that owed Winterfell loyalty, stretching back through the centuries, all of them answering the last Stark in the North's call to arms. 20,000 men assembled and began the long march south. At some point on that march, during the council of war held by firelight after the day's riding, Jon Umber, the Greatjon, enormous and loud and more bear than man in everything except taxonomy, stood up and refused to accept any southern king, any Baratheon claimant, any authority based south of the neck. He wanted independence. He wanted the North back. And when he finished speaking, it was as if the whole room had been waiting for someone to say it, because the thing that had been unspoken since Torrhen knelt by the trident 300 years ago suddenly had a voice. Yet the Lords of the North declared Robb Stark king in the North, the first in 300 years. He was a remarkable general, too young for command and therefore unencumbered by the caution that comes from imagining defeat too vividly. He won battle after battle in a southern campaign that stunned the Lannister forces. He captured Jaime Lannister himself, the best swordsman in the kingdoms. He outmaneuvered Tywin Lannister, one of the finest military minds of the age, at the Whispering Wood and the Battle of the Camps, winning engagements that more experienced commanders would not have attempted. The North remembers how it felt, watching the young wolf fight. There was something in it that felt like a restoration, a return of something that had been held back for too long. A Stark riding at the head of a northern army, all fighting for northern independence, winning. It felt, for the first time in 300 years, like the crown might come home. But Robb was also the son of Ned Stark, and he had inherited his father's deepest quality, which was also his father's most dangerous flaw, the belief that honor could survive in a world that had stopped believing in it. He broke his word to House Frey. The Freys held the twins, twin castles at the most important river crossing in the west, and they had agreed to let Robb's army cross in exchange for a marriage alliance. Robb had promised to marry one of Lord Walder Frey's daughters or granddaughters. He had shaken hands on it, given his word as a king, and then, while recovering from a wound at a castle in the Westerlands, he had fallen in love with the Lord's daughter, who nursed him back to health, and had slept with her and had married her, because in his mind a man of honor does not take a girl's virtue without giving her his name. It was genuinely honorable, it was completely true to who Robb was, and it alienated House Frey so completely that the rest of his campaign was operating on borrowed time, the Red Wedding. This is the most devastating event in the history of House Stark, the event that comes closest to ending the story entirely, the event that the North has not forgotten and will not forget. Robb Stark arrived at the Twins with his army to attend the wedding of his uncle Edmure Tully to a Frey daughter, an arrangement made to partially repair the Frey alliance. He arrived with his mother, with his wolf Grey Wind, with his pregnant wife Jane. Yet he arrived under the protection of guest right, the ancient law that says a host may not harm those who eat his bread and salt under his roof, a law so old and so fundamental to Northern culture that its violation is not merely a crime, but a kind of sacrilege. Walder Frey fed them. He gave them bread and salt. He smiled at Robb across the table. And then the music changed to the song called The Rains of Castamere, the song that Tywin Lannister had arranged as the signal, and the doors of the hall closed, and the musicians revealed themselves as crossbowmen. What happened at the Twins was not just murder, it was the calculated destruction of everything the North had built in the war, the leadership, the army, the hope. Robb was killed by Roose Bolton, who had been working with the Lannisters in secret for months. Grey Wind, someone trapped in a pen outside the castle, was shot by crossbow bolts. Catelyn Stark, who tried to bargain for her son's life to the very last second, had her throat cut where she stood. The musicians had been killers all along, and the celebration had been an execution, dressed up as a party. Outside the castle, the Northern soldiers camped along the banks of the river were attacked by the Frey and Bolton armies. Drunk, unsuspecting, cut down in their tents and on the riverbank. Robb's wolf had been penned specifically to prevent him from defending his master. The entire operation had been designed to eliminate not just the king, but the army and the hope simultaneously, leaving nothing for the North to rally around. Afterward, the Freys desecrated Robb's body. They cut off his head and sewed Grey Wind's head in its place, an act of mockery so ugly it was meant to make the image of the king in the North grotesque and ridiculous rather than noble, to erase the dignity of what Robb had been by replacing his face with a wolf's head and parading the result through the courtyard. The North would learn of this, and the North would remember. The aftermath of the Red Wedding was the lowest point in House Stark's long history. The family was scattered. Ned was dead. Robb was dead. Catelyn was dead. Sansa was a prisoner in King's Landing, married against her will to Tyrion Lannister. Arya had been at the Twins, had nearly been inside the castle when the massacre began, had been outside when it did, had seen Grey Wind die, and had been carried away by the Hound in a daze of horror that she would spend the next several years trying to process. Bran had left Winterfell months earlier on a northward journey that only he and the people with him knew about, believing he was following some internal pull toward a destiny he did not understand. Rickon, the youngest, had been sent in the opposite direction for safety. And Jon Snow was at the Wall, bound by his vows to the Night's Watch, unable to act on behalf of the family whose name he carried without truly belonging to. The Boltons were rewarded with the lordship of the North. Roose Bolton, cold, calculating, the kind of man who could smile at you across a table while he arranged your death, was named Warden of the North. His legitimized bastard son, Ramsay, a creature of such spectacular casual cruelty that even the brutal world of Westeros produced very few like him, took possession of Winterfell. The Grey Direwolf came down from the walls. The flayed man went up. Winterfell under Bolton rule was not Winterfell anymore. It was a body walking around without its animating principle, a castle going through the motions of governance and shelter, while the thing that made it what it actually was, the Stark presence, the old gods, the ancient weight of 8,000 years of continuous inhabitation by the same family, was entirely absent. The winter town outside the walls, which filled with small folk every time a hard winter came because they knew that the Starks would ensure there was food and warmth enough for everyone, was empty. People had stopped coming, or had come and left when they found Boltons behind the walls instead of Starks. A farmer in the Riverlands, hearing about what had happened at the Red Wedding, made an observation that carried the whole truth of Northern culture in one quiet sentence. He said that when people ask who his lord is, he always thinks to himself that there used to be a Stark in Winterfell, and when there was, a maiden girl could walk the King's Road in her name-day gown, and no one would trouble her. But the nights are colder now, and doors are closed. The lights go out when the Starks leave. The cold that the family had always been the bulwark against returned, not as metaphor, but as literal truth, as the winter that had been threatening all along finally began to arrive. Section 10, The Scattered Wolves. Arya, Sansa, Bran, and Jon. They were scattered across the world, the last of the Starks. 4 children going in 4 different directions, each one carrying the name and the weight of what that name meant into places it had never been designed to go. Each one being shaped by their circumstances into someone their father could not have predicted and their grandfather would not have recognized. Let's follow them one at a time, because each story is worth its own attention. Arya Stark. She was 9 years old when she arrived in King's Landing and found a dancing master named Syrio Forel, who taught her to fight in the Braavosi style. Not the heavy Southron approach of broadswords and shields and brute force, but something lighter, quicker, more economical. Water dancing, he called it. Though what he was teaching her was harder and more demanding than anything as beautiful as that name suggested. She learned to move the way water moves, around obstacles rather than through them. She learned that speed and placement could overcome size and power. She learned, from a man who would eventually face death without flinching, buying her an escape with nothing but a wooden practice sword and his own refusal to stop, what it meant to fight with everything you had and nothing held back. After her father's execution, Arya was loose in King's Landing without protection, disguised as a boy, watching the city with the sharp, cataloging attention of someone who has nothing but her wits and her thin sword, and the list of names she was compiling in her mind. The list grew over time. Yet the names of the people responsible for her family's destruction, spoken in her head like a prayer before sleep every night, maintained with a precision that spoke to something changing in her. The open, fierce, questioning girl she had been at Winterfell, slowly being replaced by something harder and more deliberate. She made it out of King's Landing. She spent time with the Brotherhood without banners, those remnant soldiers fighting an unofficial guerrilla war in the Riverlands. She traveled with the Hound, that enormous, scarred, complicated man who was technically her enemy, but who protected her through his own particular code of self-interested pragmatism. She watched him almost die and left him by the side of the road, unable to kill him and unable to help him. As another item added to the list of impossible choices that her life was becoming. She went to Braavos. She went to the House of Black and White, where a guild of assassins called the Faceless Men operated under the auspices of the many-faced god, a deity of death whose service required the abandonment of everything that made you a particular person, the stripping away of name and history and attachment. She learned to be no one. She practiced the abandonment of Arya Stark. She could not do it, not entirely. When the assignment came that required her to kill someone who did not deserve to die, a theater actress who was performing a play that mocked her family, a woman whose only offense was having been given as a target, Arya refused. She chose herself over the guild. She chose Arya Stark over no one. She fought her way out of Braavos with everything she had learned from the Faceless Men, which was considerable. Not a full assassin, but something in that direction. Something that understood how to move through the world like water, how to change faces and change names and be whatever the moment required, while keeping underneath it all the hard core of herself that the Faceless Men had tried to dissolve and couldn't. She sailed home with a list of names and the capacity to act on them. Sansa Stark. She had been, at the beginning, everything a northern girl was not supposed to need to be. Graceful, politically adept, careful with her words, interested in the southern world of courtly etiquette and tournaments and the stories of great ladies who influenced events from behind the formal structures of power. She had been called naive. And in some of that criticism was fair. She had believed in Joffrey's surface beauty for too long, had been slow to recognize that the world she had prepared for was nothing like the world she was actually living in. But Sansa learned. She learned the hard way, in the hardest school. As a prisoner in King's Landing, surrounded by people who had killed her father and who held her as leverage against her brother, who forced her to look at Ned's head on a spike and called her terrible names and beat her for Robb's victories on the battlefield. She learned to keep her face still. She learned to say what was required and feel nothing visibly. She learned the language of power from the inside of captivity, watching how Cersei operated, watching how Margaery Tyrell navigated, watching Littlefinger construct his webs and always wondering what he was building toward. Littlefinger took her out of King's Landing after Joffrey's death, and then used her as a piece in games that she could understand only partially, a tool deployed against other tools while Littlefinger measured angles she couldn't fully see. He moved her north, eventually, to Winterfell, to the home she had been dreaming of through years of captivity and terror. But the Winterfell she arrived at was Bolton territory, and her presence there was part of Littlefinger's scheme to position himself as the power behind a northern throne. And the cost of her homecoming was a marriage to Ramsay Bolton that was the worst thing that had happened to her in a life that had contained very few good things. Sansa escaped Winterfell with Theon Greyjoy, who had betrayed the Starks years earlier and been remade into something broken and hollowed out by Ramsay's years of deliberate destruction. She went north to Castle Black and found Jon Snow. And the reunion between them, two people who had never been particularly close as children, who had been separated for years by events that had turned both of them into entirely different people, was one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire series. The shock of recognition, the relief, the knowledge of how much had been lost. Sansa was the Stark who internalized the most important lesson of everything they had been through. She was the one who understood that honor, while necessary, was not sufficient. That the game was real, that it had rules. And that the only way to protect the people you loved was to learn to play it. Not to surrender your values, but to understand that values without strategy are just wishes. She had watched her father play the game on the assumption that everyone shared his rules, and she had watched him die for it. She would not make that mistake. Bran Stark. He had been pushed from a tower window by Jaime Lannister as a boy, pushed because he had seen something through that window that Jaime could not allow him to report, something that would have unraveled everything the Lannisters had built. He survived the fall, he lost the use of his legs, and in the long months of recovery, during which his body slowly accepted the permanent damage while his mind tried to find a way to live inside it, something else began to happen. Bran had always had gifts. At the Stark line, traced back to Bran the Builder and his negotiations with the Children of the Forest, carried traces of the deep magic of the old world, the ability to slip into the minds of animals, to run with the wolves, and fly with the ravens, and move through the world as something other than a limited human body. Some Starks had this more strongly than others. Bran had it more strongly than any Stark in living memory, perhaps more strongly than anyone since the Long Night. He went north, carried by a gentle giant named Hodor, and guided by the Reed siblings Jojen and Mira, following the pull of a three-eyed crow in his dreams that called him deeper and deeper into the cold. He crossed the wall. He found the cave of the last Greenseer, the last human being who had achieved full connection with the Weirwood network. The living internet of ancient trees whose roots went everywhere in Westeros and whose faces had been watching the world for thousands of years. Brynden Rivers, a Targaryen bastard called Blood Raven, had been sitting in that cave for a century, slowly merging with the Weirwood, becoming something that was less a person and more a way of seeing. Bran absorbed everything Rivers had to teach him. He learned to fly backward through time in the memory of the Weirwoods, to watch events that had occurred centuries ago with the clarity of a present observer. He watched his father as a young man. He watched the Tower of Joy. He watched things so old that the language spoken in the visions was barely recognizable. He began to understand what the Weirwoods knew, which was almost everything, and to carry that knowledge as a weight that gradually replaced the weight of ordinary human caring, not cruelly, but simply through substitution, the way a large thing moves into a space and displaces whatever was there before. By the time Bran completed his transformation into the three-eyed raven, he was already not quite Bran Stark anymore. He was something more and something less simultaneously. The boy who had climbed the walls of Winterfell and dreamed of nights was gone, or at least very quiet. What remained was a consciousness vast enough to hold the whole history of the world, and patient enough to wait for the moment when that knowledge would be needed. Jon Snow. He had grown up at Winterfell as a Stark in every way except name. He had the face, the long northern face, the gray eyes, the gravity. He had been trained by the same master-at-arms, educated by the same Maester, raised in the same Godswood, where the same Weirwood watched with the same red eyes. He was closer to Arya than to any of the true-born Stark children, probably because they were both outsiders in their own ways and recognized it in each other. He took the black and went to the wall, driven by the bastard's need to belong to something unambiguous. The Night's Watch took you regardless of your parentage, offered you a place and a purpose that did not depend on who your father was. He rose through the Watch through a combination of intelligence and genuine courage, and the kind of moral seriousness that gets people killed in comfortable situations, but turns out to be the only thing that works in desperate ones. He made peace with the wildlings. Not because he liked the idea, but because he looked at the evidence, the expanding army of the dead, the growing threat beyond the wall, and understood that the humans on both sides of the wall needed to stand together or die separately. He arranged for the wildlings to come through the wall and settle south of it, protecting them from the army of the dead and simultaneously giving the Night's Watch a reserve of fighting strength. For this decision, his own brothers killed him, drove their daggers into him, and left him in the snow, and he died. And then he was brought back. The Red Priestess Melisandre, who had been watching Jon Snow with an attention that went beyond personal interest into something more like prophetic recognition, performed a ritual over his body, and Jon Snow woke up with a gasp. Yet looking at the sky above Castle Black with the expression of a man who has discovered that death is not the worst thing and is trying to figure out what comes after that. He was different after the resurrection, not transformed in the way Bran had been transformed, not alien, but quieter somehow, as if the experience had burned away some of the urgency he used to carry and left behind something that was more still, more deliberate. He had died for his people. He had been brought back. What was left felt less like duty and more like purpose. Section 11. The Wolves, Rhaenys, Battle of the Bastards, and the Great War. The reunion at Castle Black was the first time any of the surviving Stark children had seen each other since the world had pulled them apart. Sansa came north on horseback in the snow, and Jon was on the verge of leaving the Night's Watch behind forever, and when they saw each other, they did what people who have been through too much and been apart for too long do. They held on. They held on in the way that survivors hold each other, with the knowledge that everyone else is gone, and that the person in front of you is part of an increasingly small group of people who remember the world that used to exist. There was no time for the reunion to be comfortable. Ramsay Bolton sent a letter to Jon at Castle Black. Ramsay Bolton, the legitimized bastard who had taken possession of Winterfell and who held Rickon Stark captive, and who was now the self-declared Warden of the North. The letter was designed to provoke, and it did. Jon called what northern forces he could gather and prepared to march on Winterfell. What followed, the Battle of the Bastards, was one of the most extraordinary pieces of political cinema ever created, and it was also an illustration of everything Ned Stark had tried to teach his children about the relationship between principle and survival. Jon charged Ramsay's cavalry when Rickon was killed, despite knowing it was exactly what Ramsay wanted, despite understanding that he was throwing away the battle plan, because Jon is Ned's son, and Ned's sons do not stand by while their brothers are murdered in front of them. He nearly died for it. The Northern Army nearly died for it. And it was only the arrival of Sansa's army, the Knights of the Vale, who she had summoned by sending her own raven without telling Jon. Yet because Sansa had learned that sometimes you keep information back in order to use it at the right moment. That saved them. Winterfell was taken back. Ramsay Bolton was locked in his own kennel and eaten by his own hounds. And Sansa watched it happen with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but something closer to completion, the recognition that one chapter had finally ended. The Grey Direwolf went back up the walls. The North had its Starks again. Jon was declared king in the North. The bannermen who had been reluctant and suspicious were won over by the declaration of little Lady Lyanna Mormont, 10 years old and made of something considerably harder than iron, who stood up in the council hall and said that Houses Manderley and Serwyn and Glover might have refused to answer the call when the Stark flag was raised, but that Mormont of Bear Island had known only one king whose name was Stark, and that Jon Snow had the blood of the North in him, and that she called him her king from that day to this day and until her last day. The hall erupted. The North remembered. But the North also had, at this point, a problem that superseded everything political. It had a threat. The army of the dead was real. Bran had seen it in his visions, had tracked its progress, had understood that the Night King, whatever exactly the Night King was, whether he was the original Night's King of legend or something else, something made, was coming with more dead than the living could count. Jon had seen it beyond the wall. And Jon had watched a man rise from the dead after a battle, and come at the men around him with the dead eyes of something that had been human once and was not anymore. Jon had pulled a castle full of wildlings back through the wall, ahead of a wave of blue-eyed corpses, and tried to make the Lords of the South understand what he had seen. And the Lords of the South had looked at him the way Southern Lords always look at the North when it says the things it says. He bent the knee to Daenerys Targaryen. It was the most controversial decision Jon made, and it was the one most consistent with everything Ned Stark had ever tried to teach him, and most directly descended from what Torrhen Stark had done at the Trident 300 years earlier. He looked at the evidence, the dead army, the living forces, the dragons. Get the math. And he made the calculation that survival was more important than pride. He knelt. He called her his queen. And the northern lords who had just crowned him their king felt the same way Torrhen's sons had probably felt, watching their father lay the crown of the kings of winter at another Targaryen's feet. But Jon's secret, Lyanna's secret, preserved in silence for 2 decades by the weight of Ned Stark's promise, was already working its way to the surface. Brand new. Sam Tarly learned from a Maester's diary that Rhaegar's marriage to Elia Martell had been annulled and that he had been secretly married to Lyanna Stark before Jon was born. Bran saw it in the Weirwood memory. The marriage was real. The child was legitimate. Jon Snow was Aegon Targaryen, the 6th of his name. And his claim to the Iron Throne was better than Daenerys's by every standard of Westerosi succession law. Jon did not want it. Jon had never wanted power, had only taken it when it was forced on him, had only led when he was the only one available to lead, had only bent the knee when bending the knee was the necessary price of the alliance he needed. The revelation of his parentage did not change him. He remained, at his core, the child Ned Stark had raised, committed to duty and to the people he was protecting, suspicious of his own claim and the violence it would generate. The Battle of Winterfell was the moment that everything had been moving toward. The Night King's army came south, past the ruins of the wall that had been brought down by the Night King riding Viserion, Issanon. Yet the dragon turned undead, and the living marshaled everything they had for a last stand at the only place that seemed right for it, at the castle built 8,000 years ago, according to legend, on the spot where winter was defeated the first time, at Winterfell. The battle was terrible beyond description. The army of the dead in their hundreds of thousands, the living in their thousands. The Night King, untouchable by dragonfire, resurrecting the newly killed to add to his ranks as fast as they fell. The crypts beneath Winterfell, where the dead of House Stark had rested for 8,000 years with their iron swords on their laps, broken open by the Night King's power, the ancient Stark dead rising and attacking the living who had sheltered there. And then, in the darkness of the Godswood, where the old heart tree stood with its carved face and its red eyes weeping what looked like blood, the Night King walked toward the three-eyed raven, toward Bran, the creature that had made itself from the memory of winter's darkest hour, confronting the creature that contained the memory of everything that had come before and after it. A girl moved through the dark. She had learned to move like water, to be present and absent simultaneously, to come from where she was not expected. She had a knife. She had the faces of people who had died for her and the lessons of teachers who had tried to erase her. She was Arya Stark of Winterfell. She was the last of the faces she wore. The Night King turned too late. The knife plunged in. The Night King shattered. The blue eyes throughout the army of the dead went dark simultaneously. They fell. And every single one of them, from the smallest white to the nearest general, collapsed as the animating force that held them together dissolved. 8,000 years after Bran the Builder raised the wall against the darkness beyond, the darkness was ended in the Godswood of Winterfell by the youngest daughter of Eddard Stark, who had been carrying a catspaw dagger, a Valyrian steel blade tied in its own way to the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy, to Aegon's dream, to everything that had been building since the first time winter came. The North had held. The wolves had stood together. And the long night, when it came, in the end, was shorter than the first one. Section 12. The legacy of House Stark. What endures after the Great War came the final political struggle, and it was in some ways more painful than the war itself, because it involved the most human kind of destruction, not armies of the dead, but the slow erosion of a person by grief and isolation, and the particular madness that comes from wanting something so badly for so long that when you finally have it in your hands, the wanting itself has become the whole of you, and the having is not enough. Daenerys Targaryen burned King's Landing. She had the victory. The city surrendered around her. The bells were ringing. And she burned it anyway, or burned something inside herself that she had been holding back for too long. And thousands of civilians died in the streets of the capital in a wave of fire that Varys and Tyrion and Jon had all feared was coming and had tried in their different ways to prevent. Jon killed her. He killed the woman he loved because she had become something that could not be allowed to continue, because she had declared her intention to remake the entire world in the same way she had remade King's Landing, and because there was nobody else who could get close enough to her to stop it. He held her in the throne room as she died, and he looked at the Iron Throne she had wanted all her life, and he let the dragon melt it. It was done. It was over. The wheel she had wanted to break had broken, but not the way she had envisioned. Jon was imprisoned. He was eventually exiled, sent to the Wall as a compromise. The Unsullied wanted him dead for killing their queen, and the Lords of Westeros needed him alive for the sake of Northern loyalty. And the Wall was the fiction they all agreed to in order to move past the moment. Yet he went north with the Free Folk, the wildlings he had fought to save years earlier, and he kept going, past the Wall, into the lands beyond. Whether he went as an exile or as something more, and as a man who had finally escaped a world that had asked too much of him and found in the endless northern wilderness the only form of peace available to someone who had been king in the north and Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and Aegon Targaryen and had wanted to be none of those things, is something the show leaves open. He had Ghost with him, the white direwolf he had taken as the runt of the litter 20 years before, the wolf who had always been his, the wolf he had almost failed at the end, but who was there when it mattered. There was something right about that. Just about the Stark child who had always felt like an outsider going north beyond the Wall with his wolf, and the people who had never fit inside the Wall's definition of civilization either. Sansa went home, in the great council that assembled to determine what form of governance would replace the Iron Throne, the council that Tyrion orchestrated from his prison cell with the confidence of a man who has had nothing to do for weeks except think. The Lords of the Seven Kingdoms chose a king. They chose Bran. The argument Tyrion made for Bran was the argument you would expect from someone who had spent his entire adult life watching people destroy everything around them in pursuit of power. Choose the person who does not want it. Choose the person who has already been somewhere beyond ordinary human desire. So who carries the memory of the world without the ambition to reshape it in his own image. Who can sit in the knowledge of what has been without needing it to be different. The three-eyed raven, whose emotional engagement with the present moment is complicated, but whose judgment, precisely because it is not driven by fear or hunger or pride, might be more reliable than anything the other options could offer. Bran accepted. Bran became king of 6 kingdoms, because the North asked for and received independence, and the North's independence was declared by the Queen of the North, and the Queen of the North was Sansa Stark. She went home. She sat in the Hall of Winterfell, in the chair that had been empty for so long, and she wore in her long auburn hair a crown of what looked like ice and crystal, something northern. Yeah, something cold and beautiful, something that said, "We are still here. We have always been here." The wolves came back to their home, and the home is still standing. Arya was already gone before the ceremony was done, which is the most Arya thing in the world. She had outfitted a ship and was sailing west of Westeros, west beyond all the charts, into waters no one had mapped, toward a horizon that existed in no existing record, and could only be reached by going further than anyone had gone. She was not running from Westeros. She was running toward whatever came next, the way she had always run toward things, with her sword at her hip, and her face uncovered, and her name her own and no one else's. There is a quality to the ending of the Stark story that is worth sitting with for a moment before we talk about the wolves. It is not a happy ending in the conventional sense. Nobody got everything they wanted. Nobody emerged from the catastrophe unmarked. Nobody went back to the way things were before Robert rode up the King's Road to ask Ned for a favor. The Stark family at the end of Game of Thrones is smaller and sadder and more complicated than the family we met in Winterfell at the very beginning, when the snow was falling and the children were playing and the direwolf mother was lying dead in the road with her 6 orphaned pups. But there is something in the ending that feels true to everything the Stark story has always been about. Not triumph, not the restoration of some perfect golden age, but continuation, persistence, the stubborn, unglamorous, entirely northern refusal to stop. Sansa in Winterfell, wearing her northern crown, ruling the independent North that her brother Jon had once been declared king of, and that her brother Robb had died trying to reclaim. Arya on the open ocean, going further than any Stark had ever gone. carrying her name and her sword, and her insatiable curiosity about what the world looks like when you have stopped being afraid of it. Bran in King's Landing, ruling with the detachment and the deep historical perspective of someone who has seen everything that came before and is not going to make the same mistakes again, or at least not the obvious ones. Jon beyond the wall, in the wilderness, accompanied only by his wolf and the free folk, and the infinite cold northern sky. None of them are at peace in a simple way. None of them arrived at a destination that resolves everything neatly. They are Starks. They live in the problem, not past it. They carry the weight of 8,000 years of winter on their backs, and they keep walking. The direwolves are worth one final mention, because in the world of ice and fire, the direwolves are not simply animals. They are extensions of the Stark children's inner lives. Their souls made external and physical, their instincts and their wildness and their capacity for love and violence given fur and fangs and the ability to run faster than anything human. The wolves of the Stark children track the family's fortunes with an almost mathematical precision. When the wolves die, something essential dies. When they survive, something essential survives. Grey Wind died at the Red Wedding, killed alongside Robb in the trap that ended both of them simultaneously. Lady died in the south, killed by Ned's own hand at Cersei's insistence. It seemed the first casualty of the Stark family's encounter with southern politics, and its first omen of what was coming. Summer, Bran's wolf, died beyond the wall, protecting his boy from the Whites, gave his life for Bran's survival in the most straightforward expression of the wolf-child bond imaginable. Shaggy Dog, Rickon's wolf, was killed alongside Rickon when the Umbers betrayed them to Ramsay Bolton. Nymeria, Arya's wolf, survived, was released into the wild by Arya in the south when Lady died, too dangerous to keep near the Lannisters, and has been running free ever since, leading a massive pack through the Riverlands. Ghost, Jon's white wolf, survived everything and went north with Jon beyond the wall. 2 surviving wolves. Nymeria running free in the south, the pack growing around her. Ghost in the far north with his boy. Yet the Starks who survived, the bonds that held. The story of House Stark is the story of a family that was shaped by 8,000 years of enduring the worst thing the world could offer, and that discovered over and over again that endurance was not the same as surviving unchanged. Every generation of Starks absorbed what the world gave them, the cold, the isolation, the loyalty, the loss, and transmuted it into something else, something harder in some ways, and in others more tender, more aware of what was worth protecting and what could be let go. What could not be let go, what the entire history of the family insists upon with the tenacity of stone, is the land itself and the people in it. Not the poor, not the title, not even the name, though the name carries meaning. The land, the north. In the castle above the hot springs, where the weirwood watches from the gods wood, and the dead rest in the dark beneath the floor, and the wolves come back when you call. There is a Stark in Winterfell again. Winter came, it always does, and the Starks endured. They always have. That is what the words mean. Not that winter should frighten you, not that the worst thing is always around the corner, but that knowing it is coming, holding that knowledge without flinching, planning for it, preparing for it, building the walls and storing the grain and keeping the people together, is the thing that makes survival possible. Not optimism, not the southern pretense that the cold never comes, or that power protects you from consequence. And just clear eyes and steady hands, and the willingness to do what needs doing when the temperature drops and the light goes thin, and everyone else is looking for someone to tell them it will be all right. The Starks do not tell you it will be all right. They stand in the cold with you, and they help you survive it. They have been doing it for 8,000 years. They will do it for 8,000 more. Winter is coming. It is always coming, and the Starks are already ready. If this journey through the history of House Stark gave you something, if it helped you sleep, or think, or remember why you loved this world in the first place, please consider pressing that like button below. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. And if you are not yet subscribed to uncut, there is a subscribe button somewhere very close to where you are looking right now, and it would make me extraordinarily happy if you pressed it. There are so many more stories to tell in this world. The history of House Targaryen, the secrets of the Citadel, the long mystery of the Children of the Forest, the full and devastating story of every direwolf that ever ran through the northern woods. We are going to get to all of them, one night at a time, one quiet voice at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about the stories. Good night. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be full of wolves.